And we're live. Welcome to another episode of the Speak for Yourself podcast. I'm Casey, your host, and I'm so glad that you are here. We have a special guest tonight, and let me bring her on. Hello,
Hello.
hello.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we were talking kind of pre-show. We've followed each other on Twitter for a little bit now, and that's where we were introduced, and now we're kind of meeting via internet, face to face. It's really cool to be able to network, with like-minded people via Twitter, and now get to be able to talk about it on a podcast.
I think this is the beauty of this is the positive side of like social media and this medium that we're able to use. I love the idea of more libertarians and more liberty-minded people like utilizing this, having conversations, creating their own podcasts, having live streams. I think we need more of them, and it is. And I mean, we're able to have conversations with anyone and everyone. I mean, I have conversations like with a lot of local people, but then I'm able to like talk with like, Dennis Pratt and Carla Garrick of the Free State Project. And now I'm talking with you, and you're in Texas, right?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, and you've been able to talk with Larry Sharp
yeah, it's
and
crazy.
yeah. So it's great. It's
Yeah,
great.
Larry and Clint. You
And
got New
Clint,
York and you got Florida now.
that was a great episode.
Ex-Californian now to
Yeah.
Florida.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He
it's wild.
escaped.
Yeah. Yeah, so, you also have your own podcast, which is also a libertarian podcast. You wanna talk a little bit
Hmm.
about what you do there?
Yeah, so I started when it's called the Latina Libertarian and did it for a couple of reasons. One, because I'm a blabbermouth and I just love to talk and I love to talk about liberty. But two, I really wanted to um, I wanted to push back on the prejudice, no, on just this idea that libertarians are like all white dudes and it's an alt-right thing and or libertarians are all Republicans that or there's a some type of entryism from the right, and I'm like, I was a Marxist. I came from the hard left.
Ooh, that's
And
interesting. I didn't know
yeah,
that.
yeah. So my goal with starting that was just to have this conversation and be like, yeah, no, like we're all kind of different. There's a lot of diversity in the movement. There's a lot of diversity, especially right now in the Libertarian Party, and just have conversations about that. But also, really wanted to talk about what libertarianism for me means in terms of applying it and living it. And part of that was, going into like homesteading and self sufficiency and some of these types of things.
Yeah, which is really why I enjoy you and, your account on Twitter. So tonight we're gonna get into homeschooling, homesteading, and just kind of personal sovereignty overall.
Yeah,
So,
cool.
so I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on those things. But first, I'm interested in your journey to libertarian, especially since you came from the hard left. Like, how was that? How did
Yeah,
that come
so
about?
I grew up in New York City. I'm born and raised there and grew up in Queens, New York. And I think typical for a lot of people that get involved, it was a couple of things. I think, the time that I grew up, I was born in the 70s. So, it was, growing up late 70s and in the 80s. And at that particular time, there was a lot of, I'm half Puerto Rican, half Colombian. So there was a lot of tumults politically happening all over the world. But in particular, like New York City and in Puerto Rico, there was a lot of stuff going on with the Puerto Rican independence movement. And so I just remember, like, as a kid, it was something that my parents didn't want to talk about because, I mean, there were acts of violence happening. There was a lot of political violence. There was just all of this kind of tumult. So I'd hear little things here and there on the news, but no one was really talking about it. And so I just always had that curiosity. So that's kind of like one thing. And, you know, growing up in the city, right? I mean, it's a very left city, it's government workers, union workers. And so the second part is when I went to college, I went to public university. And so I was in this environment where, for the first time I had access to information, but I also had access to people who were involved in different types of movements, and in particular, the Puerto Rican independence movement, which I support. I support sovereignty. I'm like, if people want to be sovereign, I mean, like for goodness sake, I support New Hampshire if they want to be separate,
Sure. Yeah.
national divorce and sovereignty and stuff like that. So I still support that. But I had access to it, and of course, there's a lot of leftism and a lot of leftists in the universities. And kind of looking back now, hindsight, it's so funny how, in my mind, I thought, oh my God, these people are like, you know, people who weren't like on that hard left. I just considered them like very conservative, and in fact, it was just people who were very centric. I thought, Democrats, like, oh my God, like those people are like not left enough. And kind of looking back, I'm like, that is so funny when you look at the trajectory of like where, how, the hard left has really infiltrated so many of these institutions, and in particular, the DNC and that party. But yeah, so that's what happened. I was just kind of involved there. And I had always been someone who was really interested in history. I was always very anti-war and anti-authoritarian. And so some of the rhetoric that I heard from those folks on the left at that point really spoke to that. And so, I became an organizer, and I was a student activist, and I was involved in a lot of things that were good things that, but certainly got caught up in the um, ideological component of it, which was, socialism, communism, Marxism. And I really saw myself in that because I thought the rhetoric matched the fundamentals of that philosophy. And of course, kind of like as I matured and, I traveled to Cuba and kind of was dealing like with, wait a minute, there are some serious things that I'm seeing here that don't make a lot of sense to the idealization from these folks, that are supporting this ideology. Like, it didn't make sense to me. And it took me really a while to kind of process that and slowly like just move out of that. And and part of it too was just maturing and having a family and living in the real world, and seeing how a lot of the policies, as they kind of came into fruition, like with Obama and things like that. And I was just like, this is like bigger government is authoritarian. And I started kind of I just made that connection. I didn't really come out of it until I moved up to Vermont. Vermont's a constitutional carry state. And so I had kind of gotten over like the hard left stuff, but I was like, oh, Bernie sounds pretty cool. Maybe this is the way, maybe it is going to be this way. And living in a state where Bernie Sanders is a senator, had the opportunity to talk with people who really had a lot to share about, that experience with having someone who's a self-professed socialist and the direction of the state, and just opening myself up to listening to folks that have different ideological ideas. And the other big thing was becoming a gun owner. And living in a rural area where you do have to take your self-defense and protection very seriously. And so that really challenged me in a lot of ways because it was such a different culture for me. And I wanted to learn about it and appreciate it. And part of that was, talking to folks who grew up in the country and who grew up with guns, and learning about what their experiences were. So I was speaking with and interacting with folks who, some of them didn't necessarily identify themselves as libertarian, but a lot of their values were libertarian values. And just slowly then I heard about, like, had a friend of mine that we connected because of the medical freedom stuff. And so what ended up happening is I became very active in the medical freedom movement. And
Was that
that,
because of your kids?
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So and that was before we moved up here. In fact, the one of the main reasons we chose to move up to Vermont is because Vermont at that time still had a philosophical and a religious exemption. And we were thinking, we need to get out of New York because they were really going after the religious exemption, and our kids are vaccinated. So we're like, yeah, we can't do this. Like, they won't be able to go to school. And so, that was one of the other main reasons that we chose to come up to Vermont. Not too long after we moved up here, they voted down because they got rid of philosophical exemption in Vermont. And we still had the religious exemption. So when my kids had still been in school, I mean, in fact, we still have religious exemption, but that's certainly something they're still going after. Um, but yeah, so when we came up here, there was just a lot more freedom in a lot of ways, especially compared to living in New York City. Um, right. And sadly, like right now, with the political dynamic that we have in our state, there's been, a lot of shifts and things like that. So that's changing, not for the better.
Yeah. I want to go back to your statement about the guns just for a
Hmm.
second. Um, what was your disposition on guns prior to moving and nearly requiring that to be where you're at?
I
Were you timid at all around guns just because you hadn't been around them, or how were you around them?
Yeah, I was very timid, and I wasn't anti, because coming from the hard left and being around people who are young, who are like Black Panthers, it was kind of like, yeah, like people should own themselves, and be able to protect themselves. Like I always kind of had that in the back of my head, but it was just something that was not part of my culture. I grew up in New York City. And as I was growing up, gun control really started getting implemented in New York City. Up until like by the time I was a young adult, like it was like full on, complete gun control. And, you can see that doesn't work because
Yeah.
violence has only gotten worse. Um, but it was just something I was unfamiliar with. And actually, one of the first times that we were in a gun store here, we were gonna buy our guns, and my husband was like, yeah, we have to do this, and you have to get training. And so I was like, okay, cool. And we were in the store, and I remember we're talking with the owner, like, and we're just kind of looking like at the display, and this gentleman walks in, and he had his rifle. He was just kind of holding his rifle like strapped on his shoulder. And I saw him walk in, and for like I like kind of grabbed onto my husband and like froze. And I was like, like, do we have to hit the ground? Like what's about to happen? And
Yeah.
the store owner's like, hey Gary. And I was just
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, this is just like normal here, right? Because it's open
Yeah.
carry.
That's part of the course for that.
And after that, I was just like, okay, like this is just, and when we were here, there was a lot more people open carrying, and it just took time to get used to it. But once I did, I was very comfortable with it. And so it was just that. It's like if you go to visit a foreign country that has customs and a language that's totally different, it's going to take you some time to get accustomed and to understand and to ask questions. And so we did that, and we were spending time with people. We joined a local gun range, and so I got comfortable, and I learned about gun safety and how to use it and how to carry it and all of that. And it just took a little time, but I think I wasn't as severely afraid as some people are. Like some people, they see a gun and they just imagine it's going to automatically explode.
Yeah.
No one touching it, just because they're so unfamiliar and they have so much anxiety about it. I wasn't at that extreme, but just kind of seeing people in the very beginning kind of open carrying was like, oh, now to me it's completely normal. And when I
Yeah. I
see
imagine
people,
that's quite the culture shock.
yeah, and when I see people open carrying, I'm like, okay, like that's someone I could kind of say hi to and have a conversation with. Like it's not anything scary. I don't perceive that they're going to hurt me at all. But it takes a little time to get there, and I think part of the issue with people who really want gun control is just I think a big part of it is because they're unfamiliar with this culture. They're not used to being in an area, in a place, and around people who are gun owners, who are comfortable, who wear them, who are very responsible. And every time I see someone with their sidearm, I feel safer than knowing them I'm in a place where most people aren't armed, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting to hear different people's backgrounds because obviously in Texas, like I grew up around it, so it's always been like a part of me. Or I wasn't always a gun owner, but I grew up shooting and all that kind of stuff.
And so
Um,
like that's how my kids are being raised. So for
yeah.
them, they're used to it. They do their 4-H class, where they're part of a shooting club, and so for them, it's something they're very accustomed to.
Yeah. So let's get into homeschooling a little bit. First off, how many kids do you have?
I have two.
Okay. And what are their ages?
So a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old.
Ooh, the teenage years. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
So have you homeschooled them the entire time, or did they start
No,
in public school?
we started in public school in New York City when we moved up here. We put them in our local elementary school, and I had no intentions of homeschooling my kids. And it wasn't until my oldest was in middle school, I think he was in about like 6th grade, when I was just realizing that the focus of the curriculum was much more on social stuff than it was, for him, because he's a very mechanical brain type of kid, kind of like an
Mhm.
engineer brain. And I was like, he needs math. Like, this is the language of the things that he likes to do. Like, on some level, like, he's going to need that. And I was um, disheartened with the fact that the standards were just every year getting kind of lower and lower. And I don't blame the teachers there really. I think a lot of this has to do with like these national standards and curriculums that are pushed.
Yeah, it seems like a
A-
very top-down problem.
Absolutely. And the thing is that here, schools used to be much more independent, from even the state. There was a lot more local control. And obviously, when we moved here, I think that shift had already happened. So I had noticed that, when they were in elementary school, I was nicely surprised, like, at how much control that the principal had in terms of being able to make decisions. They didn't have to go to the district office and ask permission to do certain things like that. That's how it was in New York City. But I think that really started to change a lot, and you definitely see that in the curriculum. It's very top down. Um, it's very oriented, with the power that unions have, here, and I think in a lot of places, and the statewide, bureaucracy of the departments of education have, in terms of saying, okay, this is what you're going to be teaching. So I was here like for that shift. And so I was like, you know what? Let me homeschool him for a couple of years, maybe 1 year. I was thinking maybe two, to try to kind of bring him up, catch him up a bit. Because the other thing that was happening is, he was having a hard time. And so, like, it affects kid self-esteem. And I was like, no, let me try something different for him, because this isn't good. And there were some things that he was sharing with me of stuff that they were focusing on in school. And I was like, why are they focusing on like the social stuff, but like they don't care
When you
about
say
like,
social stuff, are you referring to, like, CRT and, like, gender ideology stuff or what
yeah.
else?
And it wasn't so much the CRT at that time, although that is full blown now.
Yeah.
And it got much worse, like, with through COVID, where both of my kids were like out at that point. But definitely like the gender stuff, like, and I was a bit shocked because it was such a stark change from the elementary to, it's literally on the same campus, the elementary school and the middle school and the high school, like they're all on the same campus. So it was so
Okay.
weird that from one building to the next, all of a sudden, like, there's this huge focus. And like, we would talk about things, and I
So was
would
it from elementary jumping to middle school or
yeah.
middle to high school?
No, elementary jumping into middle school. So
Oh,
like that,
wow. Okay.
between like 5th and 6th grade, like, so much emphasis on this, and almost, I don't want to say a de-emphasis, but certainly the deprioritizing of certain basic things that are like, um he really needs to like be able to do multiplication, like even just like basic things. And it seemed like, and actually, like, I don't know if it was one of the teachers, but someone explained to me that, Obama's, national education campaign was it called, I think his was called Race to the Top.
Yeah, that
And
sounds
one of
right.
the things with his educational campaign was that if there was an accommodation made for one child, you had to make that accommodation for all the children, even if they didn't need it. So, for example, if you had one child that needed a little bit more time with their times tables, and the accommodation was going to be they're going to get a copy of their times tables that they can refer to, then you have to offer that accommodation for all the kids. So what ended up happening is that every kid got this thing, and they never took it away. So it's like, okay, you're going to have this for the first week, but then like in a couple of weeks, like we're going to get rid of it. And so, like as he progressed in grades, it's like, you still have this cheat sheet? Like, what's going on here? Like, I was supposed to have these memorized by like the end of fourth grade or fifth grade or whatever it was.
So did it become kind of like a crutch?
Yeah, and and that's just one example. It was like so many different things, and I thought, we're really lowering the expectations of what kids should, could be doing. And I understand there's some kids that need accommodations for a variety of reasons, but then it's like, okay, then let's work with those individual children. Like it doesn't mean everyone, but that's what that. And so one of the teachers, or I forgot who in the school, was explaining, yeah, this is why we do this. It's because of that. And I was like, that explains a lot. That makes a lot of sense. Um, I mean, for example, I had to sign a permission slip for my son to learn about the Holocaust.
Oh
But,
my gosh.
right, but they did a week-long curriculum on LGBTQ rights, and I didn't even know about it. My son was telling me about it.
And there was no
Um,
opt out for that.
No, and it's not that I would, but I would have liked to know like what the emphasis was. And when he told me, I thought the emphasis was like from a civil rights class,
Hmm.
but it wasn't. It was about kind of um, introducing it. And what's interesting about that is there was this whole week, I think it was like the end of fifth grade or sixth grade, and when the next grade started, when that was, and it was at the end of the year because it was in June. um, by the next fall, there were several kids that started that school year identifying as non-binary or trans, and it's like, what happens in a few weeks off from school? Now I'm not saying it was because of that, but it's just interesting that there's this emphasis put on it, and then you have 6 kids in a class of 30 that are saying, and I'm like, well, that's probably not even statistically possible
Yeah, I was about to
considering
say.
that they're like 1% of the population. But I think this is just what's happening. And this was pre-COVID. And I know that, so that's when I started homeschooling my oldest. I didn't have any intention of homeschooling my youngest. Then with COVID,
So what grades did they start homeschooling in?
for my oldest, I believe he started at 7th grade. And then my youngest, he started at 5th grade, and that was just like with COVID. And with my youngest, he wasn't able to do this virtual part-time, and that end of the year from like March 2020, like for that year, I mean, it was horrible. And I can imagine so many parents, I mean, kids were getting depressed because they couldn't be with their friends. And like my son, it was like he was on this video camera. He was on his iPad, and he would ask me like, why can't I see my friends? Like, he didn't want to participate in that because he's like, but I can't spend time with them.
Yeah.
And so it really was something that was really upsetting. And so when the fall came, they were doing like, oh, we're going to do half of this virtual and half. And I was like, I'm just going to homeschool him as well, like just full, because he had such a hard time with it. And we weren't able to really get anywhere. And it was just like so much anxiety of like, oh, we got to get this done on this iPad. It's just like, it just didn't work for him. And with the homeschooling too, I realized also that he was going to kind of have this curriculum focus as well. And I think honestly that the one of the positive things that came
Wait,
out,
can you clarify what you just said? He was going to have the same curriculum?
curriculum focus as his older brother, right? Like
Oh,
he was
okay.
going to have that same focus on the um, ideological push that's happening in the schools. So I was like, and my younger son is much more on the spectrum. So I was like, he's very vulnerable in that sense. And I just wasn't comfortable with that. I was like, I don't want him to be focusing on that when I need him to be focusing on the academic things too. Just thinking in long terms. Um, they need to be able to be functional. They need to understand, like, they need to be able to read and write and express themselves. They need to be able to be proficient in mathematics. I mean, for when they're older, so they can be functional people and have jobs. And if they want to go into trades, I mean, or whatever, these are important skills that they need to have. So
Do you
that,
think do you think all of this push is an intentional dumbing down of the society through the schools, or do you think it's just a byproduct of them injecting all the social stuff into school studies?
hmm, I think very much a bit of a conspiracy theorist. I like to joke, I don't have a tinfoil hat, I have a tinfoil crown. I do I do think, well, I do think it is intentional, and I'll give you an example. When I was living in New York City, I had one of my good friends, a relative of hers worked for the office of, oh gosh, I forget her name, the congresswoman. She represented part of Brooklyn. I think her name is Nydia Velasquez. I probably shouldn't even say that name, but anyway, she worked for the congresswoman. And Hillary Clinton, this was back when Hillary Clinton, I think, was the senator for New York, or running. She was running that. So this is way back in like the early 2000s or whenever that happened. And she was having a meeting with the congresswoman and I think with members of like the school district or the teachers union or something like that. And she asked about what were the test results, the standardized test results for the third graders. And she was saying, I need this information because based on this information, we're going to know how many jails we have to build.
Oh, wow.
So that always stuck in the back of my head. And obviously, in a Puerto Rican neighborhood, I mean, you say something like that to someone who has kids in the public school, they're going to let everybody know. So that information
The
got
ears are
out that
perking up. Yeah.
like Hillary Clinton just said this in the congresswoman's office. People were pissed, and like my friend told me, and she was crying. She was like, these tests are horrible. Like her son was under, so much pressure. Um, and that was like one of the other reasons, like we definitely wanted to leave the city because we were like, oh my God, we don't want to have our kids go through this stress. And one of the things that was happening in the public schools was that the test was a determinant if the child was going to be promoted to the next grade. And so you can imagine, like, if you have a child that has an IEP or something, that's going to be an incredible amount of stress, even if you don't, like all this pressure. And so we were like, yeah, we need to get out of here. But so I don't think it's too much of a conspiracy theory. I think there is something happening because all we have to do is look at the results. I don't know when they decided to have a federal Department of Education that was started in the 70s, if they figured, this is really going to be something that makes education better. If we just look at the numbers, since we have a Department of Education federally, the numbers have been consistently going down.
Yeah.
So I think it's a combination of things, certainly. I think what has happened is that I think education has become industrialized, like I call it the educational industrial complex. When you look at the curriculums, these companies that create these curriculums, one school buys a curriculum for the year. It's like $100,000 or hundreds of thousands of dollars they spend on this curriculum, right? Because it's not just the books, it's the software, it's the lesson plan for the teachers, it's the tests that go with that, it's all the standards that the teachers have to constantly refer to. And it's really made education centralized in this way, and much worse for teachers. And there's so many good teachers who know how to teach a material, but they have to do it a certain way. And now we have this infusion of ideology, part of it being that social component with the gender ideology, and part of it now I think with the CRT and that. But there's more to it. And I think that part of the focus is maybe wanting kids to have a de-emphasis on, reading, writing, and arithmetic, even though it's like we need young people to go into STEM, but it's they're de-emphasizing these things, and they're putting much more emphasis on humanities, which is, focusing on books and stories and things that are very recent. One of the things I was shocked, when I was looking at my son's like summer reading lists for middle school, there was no books from the 20th century. All the books that were on his reading list like were from the last 10 or 15 years. And I'm like,
Hmm.
okay, when I was in sixth grade, I had to read over the summer, I had to read, Catcher in the Rye, To Kill a
Yep.
Mockingbird, um, Fahrenheit 451. Those were like all the books I had to read like for sixth grade. And I was like, not even one of those. So when I took my son out, I homeschooled him, the first book that he read was 1984.
That's awesome.
And it kind of set the stage because, and we listened to it also like through audiobooks together. And it really kind of opened the door like for him to really have these conversations and ask questions, and look at history and try to understand like different things for himself. And he's very self-driven learner, which has been great.
Yeah. Yeah, in the circle that we run in on Twitter, the libertarian circle, you kind of always hear that a dumber population is more easily controlled. So it
100%.
has to start somewhere, and it starts with the kids because they're more impressionable. You know,
Yeah,
so that's
I
something
think,
I always kind of watch for.
and I think I read a quote like on Twitter, like a meme, that it was a quote from Lenin that said like, give me one generation, like give me one generation
Hmm.
and like I'll have them, like, something to that effect. Like with one generation, I can have them completely controlled. And I mean, I look back at, my university experience. I mean, and I was always going to, I love learning. So like, I went to university for like 10 years. Like, like I'd start studying something, and I always worked, so I'd go to school at night. And I really did notice like this shift of focus and things like that. Um, and there's definitely something going on a larger level of wanting, and we see it, right? Like there's um so many more young people who go to school to go into like social sciences, and less who are going into, let's say, harder sciences, for one example. But even like going into trades and or going into like to be business owners and entrepreneurs. If you go to school because you want to study this really, subject, and the only thing you're going to be able to do with it is to be a professor in a university, like that's such a small, component. And then we
Yeah,
wonder why so many people have student debt and are unable to pay it, because they come out with this degree after 4 or 5 years, and they're not able to get a job in gender studies or feminist writings. Or and it's weird, like I'll look at like schools and like what their majors are, and it's like, wow, it's before it used to be like sociology, and now it's just like 54
right. Yeah,
things that you could study that were once kind of under sociology. It's interesting to see like how all of that has shifted.
sure. Well, so before we went off on that conspiracy kind of tangent, uh, you had mentioned that your kids were not able to see their friends during COVID. Um, so
Well,
I'm
they made
curious.
new ones.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm curious to see if after you made the homeschool switch, did they form new friend groups? With do y'all have like pods, or I don't know what you refer to them as, um, with other homeschool kids, or did they keep their original friends from public school, or how did that work?
Yeah, so interestingly, unfortunately, like some of the friends from public school, their parents got like really into the COVID stuff and didn't want their kids to be with anyone. I mean, I had a parent tell me that like her kids basically quarantined for like almost 2 years because part of their caregivers were the grandparents, and they were so paranoid. And I was just like, wow, like that's, insane. And what ended up happening too is, we were pretty early on aware that a lot of this was becoming increasingly authoritarian, that this is not what they were saying it was. And so we were already like, yeah, we need to be around people who are understanding. And thankfully, I had already like had some good friends that kind of were on that same wavelength. So we had a very small community. But then I started reaching out like into the homeschool world locally of like, hey, is anyone open to, like meetups? Because it was hard to negotiate like who are going to be people that are going to freak out. Like if you're like, hey, we're going to have this meetup in this park, and you show up and you're not wearing a mask and they're all masked. So um, right away, like kind of groups were being formed on Facebook of like safe meetups, but the safe meetups was code for like, we're not masking, and in one of the posts I started saying, well, this is what I do to support our immune system. And I was like, we go outside every day, we have elderberry syrup, we're eating healthy, my kids are, my kids go, are exercising and they're playing, and then other parents were sharing, yeah, this is what we do, and kind of the same thing. So we're like, okay, great, cool. And we found like a group of parents and kids who are, on the same wavelength in terms of realizing that this is, a pandemic, or, COVID mania, or corona fascism, like whatever you want to call it. And our kids needed to like be around other families that were getting it. And so, yeah, we developed where we'd like meet up at locally, or they would come over, and the kids like were able to really form like healthy relationships with, kids, and just be kids. And they started calling themselves the freedom kids, because they knew right away, like
That's
when
awesome.
they would go to we would meet them somewhere like at the lake, or somewhere, and maybe we'd go into like a local shop, and they knew right away, like they were the kids that like weren't wearing masks, that were running around, that were kind of having fun. And like they would notice that there were other kids who were like masked up or sitting, who wanted to play with them, but the parents were like, no, we're social distancing. So they would ask like, are those kids freedom kids, or are they like COVID kids, like.
Yeah.
And these are just kids figuring this out for themselves. Like they had to put an understanding to it. But I thought that was pretty powerful. And, they're
And
pretty
that's
connected.
gonna stick in those kids' minds.
Yeah, I mean, and the conversations that they have is pretty incredible and telling. And I mean, my heart does break though for this generation, because I'm like, um, what we already see like the anxiety. I mean, the kids in public school, I see so many with so much anxiety. And um even kids like now, like sometimes we'll go to the supermarket and I'll observe kids, and it's like the first thing they do is they go and they put the Purell, and they're like nervous. And it's like we're creating a generation of hypochondriacs, people with like histrionic personality disorder and all types of things, that they're so nervous and they don't even know how to relate anymore socially. I mean, when the kids went back to school in 2021, they had to have their temperature checked before they went into the building. The parents couldn't even get out of the car. They were sitting in their desks with this plexiglass. They weren't even allowed to like really talk to their friends. They had to have the mask all day. What was happening in schools, the requirements that the schools had for children, is criminal, because they weren't even doing that to the adults. The adults were able to go to like a break room and take their mask off and eat. They were able to socialize with their coworkers. I mean, pretty much any other environment, even within the school, like they were able to do this, but the kids had the harshest requirements. And to me, it's like, that's pretty abusive. And like, why do you hate kids? They were the
Was it Stacey Abrams that took that like semi-famous
right.
picture in front of the like
And
kindergarten class?
she wasn't
She
masked, and all
wasn't
the kids
masked, and all
passed.
the kids were. Yeah.
Yeah, and supposedly it was, I mean, the rationale was because she'd just been vaccinated or something. I'm like, if anyone needed to be wearing a mask, it was probably you. And I mean, yeah, it was, the tone deafness is astounding.
Yeah, my heart breaks for those kids. It's so unfair what happened to them, and it's not even their choice. It was forced on them,
Right.
and we're not gonna know the full effects of that for a while.
I think some of these kids, when their parents are older and need to be taken care of, like they're gonna be shocked at they're gonna get like dumped somewhere and the kids are gonna be like, yeah, I'm not taking I don't know. It's gonna come out in weird ways, I think.
Yeah, we took our kid to a science museum a few days ago, and there was a family that was fully masked there, family of 4, still masked. It's in Texas, like,
Yeah.
it
Isn't it
was a
hot?
wild sight to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite hot yet. You have cold mornings and hot afternoons,
Nice.
that sort of thing here, but yeah, it was wild to see, and you're just your heart breaks for those kids because it's not them, it's their parents whose brains are just broken at this point. They were broken by COVID, you
Yeah.
know? And it's their kids that have to face the consequences of that, and that's so sad to see.
Right. It is.
So, back to homeschooling a little bit, tell me a little bit about, a little more about the social part of that. Um, do you have, like, pods that meet together, like, once a week, or, do y'all have sports or other, like, electives that they kinda do together, that sort of thing?
So part of what happens is we do a lot of unschooling, honestly, and we try to make
Meaning
everything.
what?
So unschooling is an approach where you don't try to replicate the school in your house. So
Okay.
homeschooling really could be, there's so many different ways to homeschool your kid. You can literally have like a classroom type of setting where you're reproducing school. Some people do that, and the kids thrive in that setting. I think most people realize early on that it could be really stressful because when kids are home, they don't want to feel like they're in school by themselves, right? Because part of the benefit in school is like, you have your friend that you can talk to, or like maybe some other. So when they're at home, it's like home is supposed to be home. So, but for some people that works. So there's a kind of a range of like what you can do. So we certainly do like where there's set things like, we're going to sit down and, we'll do some math sheets, we'll do some cursive. The cursive book that I use is the US Constitution. It has the Declaration of Independence. So that covers like our history, that covers kind of
That's cool,
cursive.
yeah.
Um, but one of the main things that we try to focus on is just like daily is life skills. So that's kind of where like the homesteading stuff comes in. I mean, we have chickens, we have gardens. So it's just a lot of like building skills that they're going to need when they get out into the real world. We bought a house that needs a lot of work, and my husband does that. And, my son helps him a lot. So the unschooling component just simply means that it's not necessarily formal. And some people do this where it's just like everyday life is incorporated and that's considered learning. And to a certain degree, that's very Montessorian, where you're really just kind of allowing like your home setting to be the learning environment. So like if you're cooking and there's measurements and not only are you learning the skill of cooking, but it's like, okay, like if this recipe calls for this much and we're going to double it, like what does that mean? And so really it's like you're taking the opportunity to make everything a learning experience. And it's also based on how do your kids learn. You know my oldest son, he could watch a documentary about something, and then he can sit down and really explain to you. Like he really is able to absorb it, and he can explain to you like what was it in this documentary. So if it was like history or like something about World War II or the Titanic or whatever stuff that he's interested in, it's just like wow, like you really learned that.
So you really
Um,
get to cater to, the way that they learn rather than have a one type fits all sort of situation.
Yeah, I mean, and the wonderful thing is that you can combine a little bit of everything. You can figure out what works for you. For some folks, it's they like an online curriculum, and the kid will do that for a couple of hours a day, and it's like, okay, we have the rest of the day to do different things. I mean, and the other thing is like my youngest son loves to ski, so like we get a scholarship for him, and he's able to ski like several weeks out of the year in like one of the best skiing resorts in Vermont. And that's like huge for him. And and from that, it's like we're having conversations about like what was it like skiing? Like, what did you ski today? And kind of like getting that out there. And, maybe he can write a story about it, or maybe we can research something about something in particular that comes up in that conversation. But yeah, you're really able to work with it. My main focus, to be honest with you, though, is spending quality time with them, because I just feel like right now, what's happening in the world, I want my kids to understand that, their parents love them, that we're here for them, that they support them, that they're able to communicate what they need to communicate with us. So yes, I want them to have their times table memorized. I want them to be able to do division. I want them to be able to like addition and subtraction quickly and all these other things. But that we can always work on. But what I want, what's most important to me is that they feel like a whole person, and that wasn't happening in that school setting. Um, and we have concerns and worries like, oh, they may not be like, are they going to be on grade level or this? And it's just like, man, you can always work on stuff. I mean, I just think back to like when I was in school, and it's like wasn't always on grade level and stuff, but I mean, I can look up and learn anything I want on any particular subject anytime I want. But what was most important is that, I felt good about myself and that I was connecting with people. So there's definitely a priority on that, because I just think we're in a time right now that our children really need to understand that we care about them, and they have a voice and they can express themselves, and that they are whole to a certain degree, that they can be able to connect with other peers their age, because they're going to need each other as they grow up.
Yeah. I think that's going to create a better person overall than what's being produced in state schools, you know?
I mean, and one of the things too is that, you know, I have found a wonderful group of friends that we connect with each other, that we support each other, in our homesteading endeavors. We're organizing like seed swap parties, and we're learning skills, and DIY and survival things. And I realize, we have this support system as parents with each other, but our kids are developing their support system with one another, with their peers. And this is going to be something that they take with them as they get older. And it's really important. Like I said, I think right now, with everything that's happening, it's more important now than ever. So, you know, sure, there's an emphasis on like academic stuff, but I think the emphasis on the connection that you have is more important than that.
Well, so let's segue into homesteading a little bit. You mentioned seed swapping parties and stuff like that. Let's start at the very basics before we get into that. So you have a house on land where you have
Yeah.
chickens, and what else?
Yes. So right now we have chickens and barn cats too. The barn cats right now are very spoiled, and they spend most of their time inside because winter's pretty brutal here, and we just love cuddling with them. But they have a purpose, like everything, every animal that we have has a purpose. So the cat's purpose is going to be to protect my chicken feed. Um, but yeah, it's
Protect the
very,
chicken feed.
yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah,
From what?
from rodents.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because we buy a lot at a time.
Uh-huh.
Um, but yeah, I like I said, I grew up in New York City, so I didn't know anything about, growing food or anything like that. Moving up to Vermont, a lot of people have a garden. So it's just like, oh, that's cool, I have a garden. When COVID happened, and those lockdowns started happening, we're hitting that 3-year anniversary, right? I
Yep.
think we just hit that 3-year anniversary this week. And
It was like on what, the 15th, I think.
the 15th, yeah.
Hmm.
And you'd go to the supermarket, and there were aisles where they were empty, and the light just went on, and it was like, something, we really need to get our self-sufficiency in a much better place. And so, I just kind of made this decision of like, I really, I always had like a small garden. It was like, really want to be able to grow our own food. The other thing that happened in March was, the kids were stuck home, and we were like, oh, like, what can we do? And so we were like, oh, we had talked about getting some chickens just as a fun kind of sciencey project, and just
Hmm.
something to do. So we got, we made the mistake of going to the local agway without the intention of getting chicks that day. And my husband and the kids went to the section with the chicks and were like, these things are so cute, let's take them home. And we didn't really have anything set up. So we ended up coming home with 10 chicks. And this is before we bought our house. So, we were renting a house. But, then my husband's like, okay, we're going to build a chicken coop. And that became a project that he did with the kids. So they built a chicken coop and we have this 10 chicks and they grew up into chickens. And we ended up like, buying this house and land. And so it was like, okay, well, we have a lot of, we have about 13 acres or so. And, we had a lot of room. And so it was just like, wow, like we could really do a lot more. And, and just learning, like, I always say, like, chickens are the gateway drug to other animals and to homesteading because they're very forgiving. They're really flexible. So, they don't have to have everything perfect to thrive. And we have we still have them, our first set of chickens, they're pretty hardy birds. And I just kind of learned a lot. And I'm like, like, yeah, like people have been doing this type of thing for a long time. Um, and that was 3 years ago. And so last year, I ordered more chicks. I ordered like very specific breeds of chicks that are what we call dual purpose birds, which means that you can breed them to be layers to give you eggs, or you could breed them to be meat birds. So I did that on purpose. And so that's our second set of birds. Our first set are called the OGs, and these are the new girls. And each cohort has its own rooster. So that's been very fun and interesting as well to have two roosters. But they're really healthy birds. And then last year also I ordered meat birds. I ordered birds to raise for the purpose of meat. And so that was really a learning experience. And, we have a freezer full of chicken, and there's nothing like pasture raised chicken. And, one of the things I realized is like, yes, certainly there's definitely like preparation and work that goes into it. But once you're doing it, you're like, this really is not impossible. And the quality that you're getting and the confidence that you build in realizing that you can be more self-sufficient. And that was really one of the big lessons that we were learning with the lockdowns and with the mandates, is that we have to be able to create something sustainable, something parallel, like a parallel economy that is sustainable, because we understand we can't depend on that anymore.
Yep.
And I think just as things have progressed in the last couple of years with the vaccine mandates and what they're doing to our food supply, it's really only reinforced that. So I'm really grateful in a sense that I've been able to connect with folks who are of the same thinking and to learn from them. And living in a rural, place, there's so many people who grew up doing this. So it's been positive that, I have many mentors and people who are like, yep, you guys are doing good. Like, that is supposed to look that way. And this is how you butcher a chicken. And, you know,
Yeah.
this is how you do these things. And so, this year we're just kind of doing it again and learning from our mistakes, because you're always going to make mistakes, but that's part of it. What I recommend for folks is, if you really want to be more self-sufficient, think of a way that you can opt out. So if you can just maybe grow one thing, like, maybe you really like tomatoes and you can grow your own tomatoes and you can learn to preserve them, then that's one thing that you've opted out depending on. And then every time, like, just add to that. If you're able to have, 3 or 4 chickens, they really don't require a lot of space. They eat scraps, including meat. They're really easy to take care of. I mean, you have eggs, and if you throw a rooster in there, nature will take its course, and you can have a continuation of that. If you have a little bit of space, you can grow potatoes. Potatoes are an incredible amount of nutrition. You can grow like 50 pounds of potatoes in not that large of a space. I mean, and that's could be a year's supply of potatoes for a couple of people. So there's definitely, it's just shift in mindset of like, how can I be more independent? And in doing that, definitely finding a community of people that are interested in supporting each other and doing the same thing. And that's really been, one of the most powerful things on this journey with homesteading, is just understanding wow, I can do this. I can do this. We can be more self-sufficient. And it's very empowering. And one of the things that, I'll tell folks is like, it doesn't matter if you live in an apartment, there's things you can grow. If you have a windowsill, like there's things you can grow on your windowsill. If you have like a good window, you get light, there's things you can grow in containers.
You can grow
There's
like herbs and microgreens and stuff like that.
You can do that. I mean, you can grow potatoes in a container. You can grow, tomatoes in a container. You can grow, there's a lot of things you can do. It just kind of depends like what you want to do and doing it. But I always look at it, and I think now it's important to understand like survivability, because our food chain is constantly being disrupted. And if you look at not only the prices when you go to the supermarket with the crazy inflation, last year and earlier this year, you know, millions of chickens were culled because they had the avian flu. And guess what test they use to see if the
Is
chickens,
it PCR or
it's
whatever?
the PCR test.
Yeah.
Um, and so a lot of these, you know, places that have chickens were getting tested. Maybe one or a couple were testing positive. Well, what they do, and again, government agencies, is they cull the entire flock, which for someone who's not, running a ginormous, industrialized factory farm, there's a lot of, family farms that they're on a larger scale. But they still have to comply with this. I mean, they're losing money, and then we see the ripple effect, right? Because now eggs are so expensive.
Yep.
So one thing is you have the inflation, but the other thing is the quality of the food that you get. So there's so much factory, or like even now, like all this food's coming out that's made in a lab. And, the largest supplier of pork in the United States is owned by the Chinese
Oh
Communist
wow,
Party,
I didn't know that.
basically. So, and I forget the name of it, but they inject their pigs. I forgot the name of the medicine. I should look it up. But so that's like so that's like your sausage, like a lot of your meat, if you're buying pork, like you're probably getting it from like the largest, supplier that's going to all these different companies. Like they each have a different label, but if they're not local, that means they're probably getting their meat. And so the quality of our food, I mean, for the last 30 years or even longer, um, is getting much worse. I mean, and we see that too, just looking at health outcomes for people. People are getting sicker and sicker, and the hugest contributor to that is what's in our food and what we're eating. So I think for a
There's
lot of
a
reasons.
there's a Joe Rogan episode a long time ago, at least like over a year ago. Um, and one of the first things that they're talking about was that uh, the nutrients in the soil had been
Hmm.
depleted to such a point that he used an orange as an example, that the vitamin C in an orange, uh, whereas in the 70s it would have, or 60s and 70s it would have been like 100% of the vitamin C in that orange is now down to like, I don't know, it was either like a third or 25%, something like that.
And you can taste it. I mean, I remember the last time I ate an orange, it was just like, this is weird. The texture was weird. It was not as juicy.
Yeah.
So, if you're, even an apple, like I mean, where we live, like it's awesome here, like in autumn, like, oh my gosh, fresh apples from local, like from a local farm where you can get, like you'll get like 50 or 60 pounds of apples. And you taste the difference. I mean, and we have some apple trees. You taste the difference instantly than what you get at the supermarket.
Yeah.
And using the example of fruit, but just imagine everything you get. And clearly you can't grow, even if you have like even if you have land, and you can't grow 100% of like what you're going to eat, but you could probably start, definitely, stop eating crap, stop eating processed food, and, focus on whole food. Even in a city, there's farmers markets, and, usually like those are your local farmers that are live like upstate or downstate from you. Um, and you're able to get at least some of that and support your local farmers. but it's just so important to reconnect with where your food is coming from and what you're eating. And I think right now, with all of this lab meat and weird stuff that they're coming up with, like the vegan meat that's got like fake blood, and that's all
Yeah.
chemicals.
Yeah, and they've I think they recently announced that it causes cancer or something like that. The
Oh, my son just told me that he read an article that
Yeah.
the the compound that they use to make it look like it has blood, I think it's that. There's something in that, and I'm just like, who would want to eat
Ugh.
that?
Well, it's funny because you had the pictures. I think it was during COVID, um, where all the meat was gone, but all the plant based,
Oh
lab
yeah,
grown
because
meat
no
was
one was
still
buying it.
there.
Yeah, everybody was buying the meat, but nobody was buying the fake tofu, the tofu meat or whatever it is. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was funny. It's like no one touches that.
So I want to get back to the chickens just for a minute. Can
Hmm.
you tell me what a typical day looks like with the chickens? Like how you take care of them?
Yeah, so chickens, when you first get your chickens, that first year, they are more likely to give you eggs through the winter, right? So after their first year, when they're like, going into 2 or 3 years, in the winter, the egg production is going to slow down to almost nothing, and that's normal. They're not getting a lot of sunlight, and so typically that's what's going to happen. So your first year chickens are going to give you more consistent eggs, and our first year chickens have been really good. We've gotten a lot of eggs to the point where we're like, we can sell some eggs and make some extra money from that. And so you want to have your chickens get as much sunlight as possible. So as early as you can in the morning, you let them out. Our chickens pretty much free range, even though we have like, I don't know how many feet of snow all around us, but um, for our area, we get chickens that are cold hardy. And so that's just kind of one of the things. And your local agri is going to have the chicken breeds that are appropriate for your area. So if you live in a hotter area, you want a chicken breed that can tolerate heat. The chickens we have here, some of them are very flexible, but some of them are very much bred to be in colder temperatures. And so, I mean, our chickens will go out even if it's below zero. They're not going to stay out the whole day, but they'll come out for a little bit, hang out a little bit, and then they'll kind of go back in their coop. So definitely in the morning, you let them out and they really do their thing. You don't have to do anything except make sure they have food, they have water. So one of the things in the winter is just kind of like, bringing out a gallon of water and like dumping out the water that's frozen overnight
Hmm.
and giving them fresh water for them to drink, making sure their inside area is clean, pine shavings, kind of throwing a layer. Now, what I do, because it's so cold up here, and what I've learned is that we have a layer of like pine shavings and some hay, some straw. Um, and so what happens is, chickens are constantly pooping. Um, so instead of taking that out on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, we constantly cover it. And what happens is that it starts to compost, it starts to break down, and that actually creates heat. So that actually is one of the things that will help to keep the chickens warm. So we just
Oh,
kind
okay.
of, so it's called deep bedding. So we just keep throwing that on top. And what'll happen is hopefully in a couple of weeks when it gets consistently warmer here, sometime in April, I'll clean the whole thing out and put that on my compost. And then I'll throw some wood chips on that, and that'll be some awesome compost soil. So that's just kind of part of this regeneration process that I'm learning with chickens. So then that compost is going to be awesome for my garden because chickens have a lot of nitrogen in their manure. And when
Yeah.
it goes into your compost, like you use that, after it's broken down, you use that in the garden.
Gotcha.
And then you
So
just put them away at night. You know, the good thing about having a rooster is that they're loud. So they tend to not scare away, but they tend to, like, predators will be a little bit more um, careful. But just one of the things is kind of being aware of predators in your area too. And so, we have a lot of woods around us, and we have, bears and bobcats and deer and raccoons and skunks and things like that. So, thank goodness, like we haven't. Oh, we lost one meat bird to a fisher cat, but we haven't lost any of our layers,
To a
thankfully.
what? A fisher cat?
A fisher cat is like a weasel. They're evil.
Okay. I've
They're
never heard of
they're
that.
yeah, they're kind of big up here, but they're big. Like they're a big weasel. Beautiful fur, but they're evil when it comes to. I mean, they'll pull a whole chicken through chicken wire. Like they're pretty brutal.
Wow.
Yeah.
So do you guys keep dogs on the premises to keep the predators away, or?
So that's one of the things that we have talked about, but we haven't gotten to that stage yet. But we have discussed that, and that is um, something that that we've talked about. One of our neighbors has a dog, so I don't know if that helps. We do also have coyotes, so kind of something along that line of trying to figure out some of these things as we go along. There are like specific breeds of dogs that would um, I think it's like Anatolian Shepherds is like one of these types of dogs. A few types of dogs that they kind of stay with your livestock at night. They're nocturnal, and what they do is they really they're the vigilantes, and they protect the flock. They stay with them. Well, they'll stay with whatever animals you have. Like so, if you have cattle, they would stay with them and they protect them, and they can take down a wolf or a coyote. They're very protective. And so I've known some friends who've had those types of animals, but we just haven't done that yet.
Yeah, my grandparents owned well, I don't want to call it a farm or a ranch. It wasn't either really. They just had land with about 50 goats on it when I was growing up, and they had, I think it
Solid
was
homestead.
two, yeah, I think it was two Great Pyrenees that
Yeah,
they
that's
kept that
that's
kept.
the other.
It was pretty
Yeah,
much just coyotes that were the problem there, and that was in East Texas.
nice.
Um, but yeah, so another thing that I want to go back to with homesteading is that you said if you can do one thing um, to basically remove that from you having to buy it from the store. Man, I'm not even saying it right, but I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so uh, my wife started getting into making sourdough and getting a
Nice.
starter ready and all that, and we don't buy bread anymore. The only bread
Awesome.
that we eat is from that starter and what she's made. So that's a perfect example of that. And
And the
then
thing is that like that bread that your wife's making, that bread goes for $7 or $8 in a bakery.
mhm.
I mean, it's such good quality, and the thing is, it's such good quality bread, especially when you're doing it the way she's doing it. Exactly. So it's like, okay, maybe you're not saving $1 million, but it's like one less thing that you're giving away to a corporation, and it's healthier for you. If you read the ingredients on bread that you get at the supermarket, it's got like 14 ingredients. Your wife literally has two ingredients. It's
Yep.
like the starter, and then you just add a little bit more flour to it. I don't know if you add a little bit of water, but you just do that every day and it keeps
Mhm.
growing. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it's interesting all the things that you can make from it.
Hmm.
At the beginning of each week, unless we do something different, she makes a batch of pancakes for my
Wow.
son. Just little mini ones that he can eat
Yeah,
with other stuff. And now it's made out of that sourdough. And then any bread that we have is made out of that sourdough. If we make like I don't know muffins or whatever, it's made from
nice.
that. So it's been really cool
And it's so much
seeing all the
healthier.
uses. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then another thing we started, we have like a main backyard, and then
Hmm.
for whatever reason, we got a little strip of backyard on the other side of the
Hmm.
house, and which is enclosed in a fence, and so we're turning that whole thing into, garden beds and stuff like slowly but surely.
Nice.
So we bought two big ones to start off with, and we planted. I think like 2 weeks ago, a bunch of different stuff just to see, what we
Right.
could grow and stuff. So it's gonna be interesting, because we're just
Exactly.
now getting into that.
Just experiment, see what, and you could, oh, this grew really well, but this didn't. And you know what? Try it again the following year, and it's like, oh, this grew really well now. There's so much information. I mean, I listen to different podcasts or like, read up on different books, or I'm signed up to all types of websites. So like in the morning, like I'll read something really quick, articles, and always it's just like, wow, I never thought of that. Um, are you able to have chicken? I really want everyone to have chickens. Are you able to have chickens where
I
you live?
don't I don't think so. I
Okay.
really want them, but there's like a HOA thing here, so
Oh,
I don't think I can have them.
the statists. Oh
Yeah,
my gosh.
but I do really
Sometimes
want
you
them.
can sometimes you can get away with like hens because they really don't make any noise. And I would really look into the HOA bylaws and see if it
Yeah,
explicitly says, because if you're able to have hens, as long as you don't have a rooster, that's understandable because they could be, they're loud
yeah,
and whatever. But if you're able to
crowing
have
at
hen,
the crack
you
of
might be
dawn.
able to have them in your back. No one would even know that you have them.
I mean, I'm down to check the bylaws,
Check it out.
you
See
know?
what happened. I mean, then there's that, the benefit is you have eggs, then you have like you'll have some compost. You can make compost from that like for your garden. So
Do you do TikTok at all?
no, I watch them, but I should do them with my chickens.
There's like a famous sound clip that's like, "Nobody'll know. Who would know?"
What
So it's
is
like,
it?
who I don't know what it's originally from. It's just a sound clip that people use for like their TikToks or whatever.
Oh, I see.
Um, but yeah, just for the hens, like nobody's gonna know that they're back there.
Exactly. Nobody would. They don't make noise. They don't bother anyone. You can have them, like you can have like four chickens in the space of like of your car. Like the space you would need to park your car, you could have like four, maybe five chickens, and they're perfectly happy. They have space to scratch. They have, their little coop or their little space to go into to lay their eggs. They don't really require a whole lot of space. And they're fun. They're cute. They're very entertaining. If you have kids, they learn a lot by taking care of them. And I remember the first year we had them, one of the things we did was like the anatomy of chicken. And so it's just like so fascinating to learn about that. And then when we butchered the chickens for meat, like that was we had like our homeschool, friends come over, and like that was one of the things that they were learning about was the anatomy. And so they were looking at, basically dissecting, right? So this is what lungs look like. This is what the liver, what the gallbladder looks like, the intestines. So they're a lot of fun.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Uh, when we kind of first started the homesteading chat, you had mentioned a seed swapping party. So
Yes.
do you have a go-to seed that you always take to these parties?
So I started last year. It's called Seeds of Liberty. And basically it's like a seed swap slash potluck slash like just kind of intro to homesteading, or if for anyone's interested. But it's open to like local homeschoolers who want to come, so it's also an opportunity like for the kids to get together. And basically the idea of it is just promoting food sovereignty. And it's just like, so I we have a lot of local seed companies where I live. So and actually like in New England, so there's like where you can order some really great heirloom seeds. And so one of these companies that I order from, they donate. You can order like seeds that are it's donation because they're incredibly reduced in price. So I'll offer that to folks. But it could be anything from like tomato, it's all stuff that grows locally. So it could be anything from like tomatoes, squashes, different lettuces, kales, carrots, oh my gosh, what else? Herbs, like all types of herbs like thyme and sage. Um, and so there's like a really decent, community here of people who, like who garden. So people will bring, their seeds. I know a woman who she grows using permaculture techniques. So last year she drove up a couple of hours and she did a class on permaculture for the folks that showed up. This year I'm inviting a friend of mine who is a master composter. So she's going to be talking about like how to compost and like how to compost anything and everything, and how to utilize that and how to do it safely, and like what are good techniques with that. But my goal is really to introduce people to liberty through food, and becoming more self-sufficient. I really see a huge intersection of people who are liberty minded and people who are into self-sufficiency and even prepping. And I like to promote that as much as possible, because I just feel like if you have that mindset that you want to grow your own food, that you don't, that you want your family to eat healthier because you don't like what's going on, you don't like regulations, if you want to be able to butcher your own animals and not have government regulators like tell you that you can't do that on your land, we have a lot in common, in terms of understanding like the importance of having those rights and liberty. And so sometimes folks don't always make the connection of like, oh, cool, like I didn't understand that libertarianism kind of covers that. Like that makes a lot of sense, that makes a lot of sense to me. And even with the homeschooling community, I think is one of those communities that it's really important for us as libertarians to reach out to, because you already don't trust the state with your kids. Like
Perfect. Yep.
most people who homeschool, they don't want, it's not like they don't have
For a
alternatives. Like,
reason.
well, right. It's like we don't want the government teaching our children for whatever reason. We want them learning this way. We want the freedom to decide the curriculum. And some states are incredibly restrictive with homeschooling. And more states even mind that, Vermont has been really good with homeschooling, but they're trying to clamp down on it because the unions want to try to have as much control of the funding when it comes to homeschooling. They're afraid of school choice. They're afraid of a lot of these bills that we see in other states where the funding is following the child. It's a huge threat
Hmm.
to them. So homeschooling, families, it's already people who are um, radical in a way, because people look at homeschoolers like we're nuts. It's like, why? And I never thought about like homeschooling my kids until, I was just like, I'm not happy with what's happening in the public schools. And, um, I want us to figure out for ourselves and do this ourselves. I think, most parents are perfectly capable of educating their children. And the experiment isn't homeschooling. The experiment is government schools. They've only been around for what, a century, maybe
Yep.
a little bit more than that. Families have always homeschooled their kids, if you really think about it. So I think that, what I was going to say earlier is that one of
Well,
the
it was a preparation for factory work by Rockefeller,
right.
wasn't it? Yeah.
That's what I saw recently, that it is based off of what is that? Oh gosh, I can't think of the name of the country. I was reading something from Corey DeAngelis, who's a huge leader for the school choice movement. Is it Prussia or something? Like one of these places, like this model was based on this model that they have in this country, and it was funded
Mm.
and implemented because the idea was that. And if you think, I mean, the public school that I went to for 1 year, because I went to parochial school but I did kindergarten at public school, all the public schools in New York City look like old factories.
Yeah.
They all have that. They're huge, and it's like a big cement block, and they have dark bricks, and um they all look like factories. I mean, and it's, everyone lines up, and everyone,
Yep.
everyone's in size, and it is exactly for that. And I think um some of the challenges is that in education is that humans don't learn the way they need us to learn in these types of settings. And I think, you know, there's always that small percentage of children who are just really resilient and who do well in that type of settings. And most kids just kind of squeeze by. And most people are going to, learn on their own in that environment, because it's just not a functional environment for them. And as much as the education industry is trying to accommodate and do certain things, I think what's happened is that it's been captured ideologically. And so it's gone completely off the rails. And I have quite a few friends who are teachers, and they're just like, they don't see themselves being teachers very long. They're miserable. They don't like the curriculums. They don't like the standardization and how they have to do things.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Do you see that they, do you think that they will, um, just kind of quit quietly? Or do you think that they will kinda make a noise about what they're, upset about?
I mean, I know a couple who are just their personality is they're more vocal, but these are folks in small communities too, so you have to be careful sometimes because there can be retaliation. And I think when things are so ideologically driven, um, and you're letting people know that you're leaving a job based on ideological things, it can be really scary because people want to cancel you, they want to go after you. I mean, for goodness sake, here in small Vermont, where everyone's like a hippie or a redneck, but we all got along, right? Like, this quintessential idea. um, During the mask mandates, I mean, we had people here who wanted the governor to create a hotline to report people for not wearing a
Oof.
mask, or to report a business who were not mandating masks when people entered. So, the ideological component of all of this, and the divisiveness that goes along with that, is really powerful. And I think there are a lot of people who just kind of want to slip away quietly because they don't want to deal with the reverberations of saying that. And
Well, that's also the perfect case for personal sovereignty, right?
yes,
The more, sovereignty that you have over your own life, the less you're concerned with being canceled and the effects that that would have on your life, right? And the more free you
exactly.
are to speak up about things that you don't like.
Right. So if you're able to be self-employed, you have your own business, if you are educating your own kids, you don't have to worry about like some of the, other things. A lot of parents, it's like, okay, make sure you don't talk about that. Here in Vermont, not in 2022, but for 2021, when the kids were sent home for Thanksgiving, the kids were told, if you leave the state or someone in your immediate household leaves the state, you're supposed to come back and report them. Make sure you let the school know if anyone left the state, because no one was supposed to leave the state to visit anyone. I mean, this is what they were telling the kids to do. So and they were like, parents who was like, oh, we already had this trip set up, and had to tell the kids like not to say anything, and it's so like nerve-wracking. And I mean, I had parents that were like, we pulled them out of school after they said that in Thanksgiving, because it was just like, we're getting reported, our kid, like they're telling our kids to report on us. So it's really
Sounds like
intense.
that Chinese revolution.
Right, where they're training the youth to turn on their parents. I mean, and it's
Yep,
right out of Orwell.
yep. Well, we're coming up on,
Oh my
an
gosh.
hour and 20, hour and 23.
Yeah.
So, do you wanna shout anything out before we go?
Well, people can follow me on Twitter, the Latina Libertarian, but on Twitter, it's at LibertyMe15. My YouTube channel is Latina Libertarian, and you can go to my website, which is olgamaria.org, and you can follow me there. And I have some stuff that I sell that's fun, some Liberty shirts and some cannabis stuff. So,
Awesome. Well, I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that we
same.
can do it again and get into some other stuff.
Me too. Thank you so much, Casey. It was
Alright.
great.
I'll see you later. Thank you for joining. Bye, guys.
Thanks.